guys, and welcome back. My name is MrCaproni, and today we're going to break down the Math ACT test. Now, I'm going to list for you every topic that is covered on this thing so that you guys know exactly what you are getting yourself into. And if we're going along and you notice any of the topics that you don't feel super comfortable with, feel free to check out the rest of my channel where I'll be posting videos weekly on every topic that will be on this test. So I hope you can join me there, but for right now, let's break down this test. Now remember, there are 60 questions on this test that you have to do in 60 minutes. They are multiple choice, but that still leaves you only with an average of 1 minute per question. It's all right. You got this. So in order for you to best understand what's going on, we're going to break down into the major 6 categories that this test is going to do. And then we're going to talk about each topic within those 6 so you know the full layout of this test and everything that's going to be on there. That way you can't be caught off guard at all. So starting off, let's take a look at our 6 major topics. We have pre-algebra, elementary algebra, intermediate algebra, coordinate geometry, plane geometry, and trigonometry. Now, I know what you're thinking. Half of those are algebra. Well, it turns out that each one of these kind of represents a different grade band for your algebras. So the pre-algebra kind of falls in the 7 to 8 grade range, whereas elementary algebra is your algebra 1 topics. And intermediate algebra is actually just algebra 2 and beyond. So that actually covers a whole bunch of algebra, but if they were to list all of those topics in one category, it would be extremely overwhelming. So they do break it into 3 major parts. With that said, let's go ahead and dive into the first type, and that's going to be pre-algebra. Now, as you can see, all the topics here for pre-algebra cover about 14 of the 60 total multiple choice questions for this test. Now, you can see here it covers everything from whole numbers to fractions to ratios and proportions. It even has things like mean, median, and mode in there. So there's a lot of topics in here, but a lot of this is like 7th and 8th grade material. So this is pretty early in your math career. The ACT states that you should be able to do this entire test by the end of your junior year, which means that all of these topics kind of fall from 7th grade up through the end of junior year. Now, with that said, we move on to our second major topic, and that is the elementary algebra. Now, this is where you're diving into basically algebra 1, maybe the end of 8th grade. This has to do with your variables. It's where you start looking at polynomials. It's where you start learning how to factor, and you look at quadratic equations. You deal with linear inequalities and other types of equations that you're graphing, all right? But a lot of the graphing actually falls into the geometry categories. So you may not see what you would expect in some of these algebra sections. This does hit about 10 of our 60 questions, so still pretty heavy hitter, but not as much as the pre-algebra. So again, let's dive into our next category, which is intermediate algebra. Now, this one's only 9 of the 60, so not as many questions, but only slightly lower than our last one of the elementary algebra. So when you're looking at this, just keep in mind this is more of your algebra 2 questions. These questions may take you a little bit longer, and they tend to be a little bit harder than the other ones that you've seen. But at the same time, that's why there's not as many questions that go along with this. So you can see here as things like the quadratic formula, inequalities. It has things like complex numbers, which deals with your imaginary number system, things like matrices, and all of that jazz. So quite a bit of content squeezed into this section, and it is a little bit more harder than usual. So as we move on from there, we start finally getting our first look at geometry. Now, as I mentioned, coordinate geometry covers a lot of stuff of what you would have expected in Algebra 1. It has to do with a lot of the graphing of our equations and slope, parallel and perpendicular lines when they pertain to like the type of equations used for them. It also deals with some transformations and conics, but that usually has to do with your equations, transformations of an equation. So coordinate geometry is very closely tied to algebra. A lot of them go hand in hand. Again, this is only 9 out of 60 questions, which means it's about as important as the last topic was, but not as big of a hitter as pre-algebra. So looking from there, we get our next major hitter, which is plane geometry, which is again at that 14 out of 60 number. So it's going to tie pre-algebra for that first place. So that means if you're going to spend a lot of your time into one of these areas, make it either plane geometry or pre-algebra. Those two really are going to carry the most weight when you're studying for this test. This one's going to be a lot more of what you think of when you think of geometry. This one has to do with all of your different shapes. So your circles, your triangles, rectangles, parallelograms, all of that stuff. So you're going to see all of the typical geometry plus some 3D geometry. You'll again talk about some translations, reflections, and the rest of your transformations. And this also hits those logical reasoning proofs that everyone loves so much. So that's going to hit up our plane geometry. Remember, 14 out of the 60 questions, pretty dang important. And that brings us to our last major category of trigonometry. Obviously, our lowest hitter here at 4 out of 60 questions. So this is going to cover your right triangle trig. It's going to cover your trig identities and your functions and their modeling. This is basically your SOHCAHTOA stuff, if you were ever taught that. It covers all your sine, cosine, tangent, all the different types of trig. But again, it's only 4 out of the 60 questions because this is usually one of the last and least covered topics for our junior year, end of sophomore year. So that's going to wrap up the entire group here. That is the full contents of the Math ACT. Remember, that was 6 major categories. Each one of them kind of have their sub list of topics. With that said, I hope you guys got what you're looking for today. Remember, if you feel like I hit all of the topics on the Math ACT, go ahead and smash that like button for me. And remember, if you're trying to increase your score on the Math ACT, you should hit the subscribe button too, because that way you'll get updates on all of my new videos where I'm covering every single topic that we went through today. There is one way to raise your ACT score, and that's by consistently practicing. So make sure you tune in every week to see that new video so you can get into practice you need to raise your ACT score. Again, thanks for joining me today, and I hope you guys have a fantastic week.